Awesome. Well, happy Monday, everyone, and welcome to today's Lunching with the League. My name is Belinda Leon. I serve on the LWV Ohio board. I've also worked as a Latinx organizer with the League, and I am now also a member of the newly formed Youth in Action group. Before we get started, I just want to share that closed captioning is available to our audience today. Simply click that CC icon you see along the bottom of your Zoom screen, and a live transcript should begin immediately. We also want to remind everyone that this and all Lunching with the League events are recorded and available on the LWV Ohio website at lwvohio.org/events. And I'm so happy to introduce our guests today, Jen Miller, Executive Director of the LWVO, and Catherine Turcer, Executive Director of Common Cause Ohio. Before I introduce them, I just briefly want to explain our format. Our speakers will begin by discussing voting rights in Ohio's democracy, and then they will have time to take questions from the audience. So please be thinking about questions throughout our session. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Jen Miller was raised in small town Ohio and became executive director of the League of Women Voters in 2018 after having been executive director of the Sierra Club. She earned her master's in arts policy, education, and administration, a program of the John Glenn School of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University. She also holds bachelor degrees in vocal music and history and ethnic studies from Capital University. Jen is a graduate of the U.S. Department of Energy and REL Leadership Academy, and her deepest passion is inspiring others to participate in civic engagement. She is a jazz singer and a proud mother of one daughter. Catherine Turcer is the Executive Director for Common Cause Ohio, an expert on redistricting reform and state-level campaign finance. Catherine advocates for greater transparency and more accountable government and helped lead Ohio's successful efforts to address gerrymandering. Catherine has a bachelor's degree in gerontology and clinical psychology from Alfred University and attended the University of Connecticut for graduate work with a focus on social group work. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guests, Jen Miller and Catherine Turcer today.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Catherine. I'm so glad we get to do this together today. It's a nice way to start the week out.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody.
So I'm actually going to start today. If my mom were alive, she would be 80 today. And she was one of my role models that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being a role model in politics, because she wasn't actually in politics, but she was a community leader in her own right. My family owned one of the only businesses in town, one of the only restaurants, the only bakery. And, my parents were really super nonpartisan in how they talked about things. They didn't talk about candidates, they didn't talk about parties, but they did talk about issues that mattered to the community and especially to children. And I think that's what brought me really to wanting to be more nonpartisan in my approach. And I think of them as role models, as really community leaders. Catherine, who's one of your role models?
Your beginning made me think about my own beginning. I am of a mixed marriage. My father was a Republican, diehard Republican, and my mother, one of those liberal Democrats. And we had some juicy, lovely fights that really informed the way I think about politics, the way I think about trying to see things from all sorts of different sides. And I was going to say, my mom was so cool. She is alive, and she is 80 years old. She was a Lamaze instructor. Also started a nursery school, a co-op nursery school, and also was a professor. So she did a bunch of different exciting things in her life. I feel like I've been so blessed by some good role models. I did want to highlight the person who led me around the State House the first time I ever went there, which is a woman named Peg Rosenfield. She was amazing. Now, I will also admit that she had just had knee surgery. And so when she was leading me around, and to this day, I only really know the handicap accessible ways around the State House, because that's how I was led around the State House. And then I think there are people like Deb Holland, who's the Department of Interior. And I really like when she was using her power to talk about murdered and missing Indigenous women as one of the first she talked about. I was like, I want to be that lady. I want to be that lady.
Yeah, that's awesome. You brought something up that I've been thinking a lot about which is this idea of trying to see things from all different sides. I mean, I think I was raised that way, and it sounds like you were raised that way. Why, as advocates, must we look from so many different angles and sides? And that doesn't necessarily mean that we agree with every side, but that we really start to think about what different stakeholders in the process think, as we're developing our strategy for advocacy, as well as our advocacy asks.
So I think the biggest challenges that we face are also the things that make this country and our state the most beautiful. And it's the challenge of a diversity of people and a diversity of ideas, and trying to come together to think through how best to create the community that we want and the government that we want. And that does mean we really have to listen to all sorts of different ideas. And I'm a super good talker. So it is a challenge. I was going to say it's a challenge to really listen and hear from different people. And I think we just need to give people the space to do that, because together, you know, crowdsourcing our problems is a really good way to move forward.
You know, I think about this sometimes because I know a lot of times I try to think about what stakeholders are thinking, and sometimes they hold very different views or opinions than I do. And I think that there's an instinct, I think, as an advocate to just shut that down, right? That their view is wrong, or that they're small-minded, but I think there's some risks to that. You know, I mean, I think that one, you know, we do need, of course, our own messaging, whether it's voting access or whatever it is, that really helps us explain to the public why we believe in what we believe. But if we just shut people down, or we just don't even try to understand where they're coming from, I think there's a couple risks. I think one is that we might not realize that there are unintended consequences. You know, that actually the way we have developed our policy actually could accidentally cause some other problems that we didn't even realize were problems, because we didn't listen to all the stakeholders, different perspectives. And I also think that if we're trying to win people over who don't agree with us, so that we can get you know, like, for example, a lawmaker who is against a bill, but we never sit down and try to figure out why they are against it, I don't know how we could possibly win them over or design the policy advocacy in a way that it serves both purposes, their concern as well as moves forward what we want. And I'm just wondering if you might have an example of something like that, where you think that it was really important to listen to opposition, and that maybe that helped you be a better advocate, or it made the policy better.
Yeah, this goes back a ways. Well, all good stories do. Yeah, this goes back a ways. But in the late 90s, we were working on this bill to put campaign contribution information online. Now, it's 2021. This doesn't seem at all controversial. It just seems like, of course, you have to put it online. This is the definition of transparency. You know, we're accustomed to thinking about a digital democracy. But at that point, there were a lot of people that were reluctant to do it. And when I started having the conversations, I assumed that the reluctance had to do with they wanted secrecy. They didn't want, you know, like, I assumed not necessarily good intention. And some of them, of course, were not necessarily wanting to open the doors to digital democracy. But there were folks who their treasurer was their wife, and she put things on pen and paper, and she filled out the forms, for example, or their bus buddy did it. And yeah, he used a computer, but, like, you know, everything went on paper, and it was like, will my partner in life, or will my buddy, whoever it is, will that person even want to be my treasurer if we transition to this way? And so once I understood, oh, they're trying to think about, like, their own campaigns and thinking about this as a real obstacle. Well, one, we just need to work through, like, how do you make this as easy as possible? And I don't know that we necessarily made it as easy as possible, but we gave additional time. We came up with, okay, your campaign doesn't raise, $5,000, you can file on paper for a couple of years. Those kinds of solutions. So I think we came up with solutions that I think worked. It went a little more slowly and it wasn't the perfect digital democracy, but it made it work for more people and it built support. And I think that's often the way to think about it, is we're not sometimes seeing the good that's there, or or an argument that's decent.
Right. So the idea of, again, just listening to folks, why are they opposed, so that we can be designing either the policy or our advocacy to build support. The idea of building support, I think, is so important. Let's talk about building support for democratic reforms. So right now across the country, there are attempts to restrict voting rights or voting access. Here in Ohio, as maybe some of you saw, Andrew Tobias at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, or Cleveland.com, had an article that something like that's coming here in Ohio. First, you want to, let's just start to talk about what we think is at risk. And then I think we should talk a little bit about how to build support. So first, what's at risk here, you think?
So what I always worry about are the things that will make it more challenging to vote. And so, when we think about, for example, reducing the number of drop boxes, or if we think about, hey, we shouldn't just have one form of ID, maybe we should have two, or some of those kinds of things, it becomes a little bit more, any of those kinds of things that just make it more challenging. That's what I end up worrying about. And, one of the things, as we think about all the different ways that we can invite people into the process, when we are playing defense, when we're spending our time saying, don't make it harder to vote, and instead of saying, hey, let's talk automatic voter registration, let's talk, all of the different ways that we could actually, more drop boxes. If we're having to play defense, we're not getting at what are the things that we can do to live up to the power and promise of democracy.
I think that's so good. I was thinking a little bit about it. For our 100-year history at League, we've actually worked on election integrity. So one of the first things we did was work on ballot standardization, and we continue to work on that off and on throughout the century. So when women got the right to vote in Ohio, literally the ballot could list one candidate that was running for an office, and then go to a whole bunch of other races, and then another candidate. That kind of unfairness, right? So just starting with having to put all the candidates together seems so obvious. Or now the idea of rotating, since we're on electronic ballots, rotating who's first, right? So that there's so that voters, there's some sort of fairness baked in, and that we're trying to really deal with bias. And so I think it's really interesting sometimes that there's this conversation that if you are for access, that means you're not serious about election integrity. But I just wanted to say, I think that they are really go hand in hand. And I wanted to know, so some of the things that are being discussed, at least as you mentioned, limiting drop boxes, more ID requirements for absentee or early voting. I'm trying to, maybe reducing early voting hours, a lot of different kind of problems. There might be some stuff in a big bill that we like, but at the same time, there's some non-starters that I just mentioned. Can you talk about how access, give me an example of how voting access and election integrity actually work together?
Well, I always think this is the best way to think about it. The more people vote, the more you're getting a representation of the community making a decision, which makes it, have more integrity. I also think when we think about the integrity of elections, so much of our election system is based on making sure that we have enough election officials and those kinds of things that are the poll workers. And I also think, we are in a really interesting time period where we should be thinking a lot about the fact that we have, for example, if you do the touchscreen voting, that we have those voter verified paper audit trails. And we should be sure that we're educating people to look at them. And I think, one of the things that can turn voters off is a sense that their vote doesn't count. And that can be literally, they're like, I'm not sure the machine works. And we need to be inviting people into that process to understand that voting and that the votes are properly attributed and counted is really important. At this point, the county boards of elections have the ability to do risk limiting audits or audit a percentage of the ballots cast. And I think we're really in a time period where we need to invite voters in, not just to vote, but also to pay attention to the election integrity.
So we have two great questions from our friend Kalitha Williams. And so, yeah, she's got two, and one is about redistricting, which we're going to get to, but she's saying, are we hearing about a Georgia style voter suppression effort being introduced in the Ohio State House? And Kalitha, that's actually what we're talking about right now. I think what's interesting is that just like you'll hear proponents of the Georgia bill talk about these ways that access improved, almost as a way of hiding some really suppressive efforts. I think that's the same kind of thing we're going to see here in Ohio, that there's going to be maybe something we like automatic voter registration at the BMV, but all these other things that are absolute non-starters, limit of drop boxes, really making it much harder to get an absentee ballot and have that count because of multiple IDs or things like that. But she wants to know what our plans to combat that are, Catherine.
Well, you are part of our plan. I think that's the thing that I think is really important. Clearly, Jen and Catherine can't do anything. We need all sorts of different people to come together and be prepared to let our legislators know what we expect. We need to do what we can to encourage voters to get engaged as well. This is a time period where it's easy when you look at something happening in another state and think, oh, well, it's not as bad as Georgia, or it's not this, or it's not that. What we need to be doing is making sure that all the public knows what the challenges are and do our calling, writing, taking action to make sure legislators know that we deserve better and that they represent us.
Good. How about let's talk about what's happening at the federal level and why that matters. So we have both For the People Act and the John Lewis Act. And so maybe we could split those up. So For the People Act has a whole bunch of things in there, HR1, now SR1, which are slightly different, but has a lot of things in there that are already Ohio law. The rights of those who have served their felony sentence, that their voting rights be restored. Just to remind everyone that that is our Ohio law. Those folks just need to re-register. Things about early voting and absentee voting, but there's some other really great things in there. So we could see automatic voter registration, which is something that a lot of us have been advocating for a long time and have been unable to get out of the Ohio General Assembly. We could see some serious changes in campaign finance reform, and transparency, especially, is something that you and I both have really advocated for, and our organizations have advocated for, so the voters can follow the money, right? Who is funding that candidate or that issue campaign, I think is absolutely so critical. I think another thing about HR1 that's so important is this idea that our congressional delegation and our US senators have to work with folks in other states. And so if there is voter suppression happening in other states and the representatives of those states were not fairly elected in terms of really hearing from all the people, to me, it seems like that makes it a lot harder for our delegation to work with those delegations, right? It seems like it's harder to ensure that what is coming out at the national level is really serving all voters, because all eligible voters had the freedom to participate. Another one of those things is redistricting reform, which we're going to get to, which I think would be really exciting. But did you want to kind of pontificate, if you will, on the John Lewis Act and what some of the things that are in there, or the value of having the federal legislation move?
So one of the things that is really clear to me is we would not have the same ability to vote if we did not have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That if the federal government had not stepped in and the federal courts had not stepped in, the ability to vote for many, many people, when you start thinking about our electorate and African Americans being able to vote, it took the federal government stepping in to tell states, get your act together. These are citizens of the United States, and let's actually hold fair elections. And so I think, there's this, oh, the federal government can't tell people, how to run, states how to run their elections. Well, it would be much nicer if the state would actually just do the right thing. But it is important to realize how important it is to establish national rules that are fair for all of us. And when we think about, the Shelby decision, Shelby.
Uh-oh, I think you just froze. Can you all hear me?
I can.
Okay, good. You said Shelby, and then we didn't get any farther, Miss Catherine.
Apparently I'm unstable, or at least it's my internet connection. And I guess what I was saying is Shelby v. Holder, that Shelby v. Holder decision that meant that there was no longer pre-clearance and changes of election rules have led to some terrible, suppression of the ability to vote. And, it's that thing, we have the pre-clearance, or hey, the Justice Department reviewed the rules before, like an umbrella for voting rights. Well, you take away the umbrella, we need the umbrella back. And so, yes, we should be thinking about For the People's Act and passing that, but we directly need to be thinking about really protecting voting rights with the John Lewis Act.
And both of our organizations at the national level have endorsed those two acts, just to be clear.
I endorse them too.
What's that?
I said, I endorse them too.
Good. All right. There's ranked choice voting is a question we have been getting. And so would you just explain what ranked choice voting is? And then I'll explain we've been getting a question on what League might do about that.
So I think for a lot of us, when we think about an election, we think about voting for chocolate or vanilla. So you vote for Catherine or you vote for Jen. But with ranked choice voting, it means that you could have, let's say, 4 different people on the ballot, and you would actually say, well, Catherine's number 1. Sorry, Jen. Jen's number 2. Number 3 would be Michael. Number 4 would be Cynthia. And you would do the same, and the next voter would do the same. And the way to do this is if, for example, you didn't get to a top winner, you would then go to the next winners. It's a little bit complicated, but if you think about the Academy Awards, when they go to vote for, oh, this movie or that movie, it doesn't work that way. You rank the movies, and then you see who ends up coming out the winner. And it's a little bit complicated. It's easier than saying chocolate or vanilla, but it is a way to make sure that we're getting a diversity of opinions. And it does make a space for other parties. So it's not just chocolate, vanilla, Democrat, Republican. It creates that kind of space. And it's been found so far to be very effective. And then we need to look at other countries as using the system. And so I think we would have a different kind of democracy, but it's well worth seeing whether this type of experiment, how it works in New York City, for example, that's coming up soon, Maine, to see how it's coming together, and then to consider, is this best for Ohio?
Yep. And just for my League members to remember that, and those of you who aren't League members, a little bit about us, in that the policy priorities that we champion and really work on are actually selected every 2 years by our members at our biennial convention. And and not just the convention, actually, it's this whole long process of the board taking feedback from members and local leagues and lots of different pieces and parts. So several years ago, we looked at several democracy reforms, and we didn't come to consensus on ranked choice voting. And so at this point, even if we are interested or we're a little bit compelled or sympathetic, we, as in the board and the staff, can't really work too much on ranked choice voting unless the the membership really kind of changes that stance or comes to some sort of consensus. We do have a biennial convention in May, so we'll see where that goes. But just to be real clear, the thing about League is that we truly are grassroots from the bottom up, and that delegates, you know, we take all this feedback from members and local leagues throughout that entire 2-year period, and delegates every 2 years set our budget, you know, set our, you know, elect in most of our board members, you know, a lot of those kinds of things. So could ranked choice voting freeze out Democrats in Ohio? I don't think it would, but I don't know.
Well, so the way to think about this is you could have, you know, many different candidates. And so would there be an advantage to one political party over another? It's not clear that there could be, but it could be that the top two, one's conservative and the next is ultra conservative. And then the third is, you know, a moderate Democrat, and the fourth is you know, a more liberal Democrat. It could be that there's a green person who pops up. I don't see that it should have a benefit, you know, a problem for one political party over the other. But I do think it's worth considering, and I can understand why the league is slowly examining it. You know, we are so blessed because we have 50 states. We have an opportunity to do some experimentation. I know there's experimentation, for example, around open primaries. We have an opportunity to see, okay, what happens in those states and how will this impact Ohio, or how could it impact Ohio?
Yep. Yeah, open primaries is a particular, there aren't necessarily objections, Laura Mormon, there's not necessarily objections to ranked choice voting. That's not what it is. It's that there's a couple, our process is really intensive. And so at that time when we were choosing our priorities, redistricting and voting access were the highest democracy priorities. There wasn't consensus that ranked choice voting should be a priority for the Ohio League. So I don't know that there is absolutely any objection, just not, there wasn't the kind of fervor amongst our members that some of our other democracy work is. So it is true that maybe ranked choice voting could be confusing. It could be frustrating. I think all these things are true. The other thing I'll just say, Laura, is a lot of times our studies are years long, literally years long. And so I wasn't part of that process, and there could be some concerns in that process. It predates my time. But because I am a servant of the membership, I can only really work on issues that the membership chooses to prioritize through our biennial convention process. So let's move on to something else though. Let's see. There's so many things. Do you want to do a quick primer on what's going on with money and politics here in Ohio after scandal after scandal after scandal? You are our most beloved expert on money and politics. Do you want to give us a few ideas on that?
So I want to take everybody back to 2005. And the Tom Noe CoinGate scandal. And at that point, we discovered that we definitely needed more robust rules. We also discovered just recently in the householder scandal, this is House Bill 6, that in fact, we need much more robust rules. So from just very quickly, you know, Larry Householder, Speaker of the House, essentially was directing a nonprofit at the behest of First Energy, which gave a bunch of money. Other organizations also gave through pass-through nonprofits. Basically, we now know there is, you know, a quite complicated chart of all sorts of nonprofits, essentially hiding money to advance an agenda and the specific, you know, things that First Energy wanted. They wanted First Energy Solutions to be bailed out. Now, we also know just recently, because of some filings, that in fact, First Energy paid no taxes during this time period, and yet $60 million. And you know, we know that everything is an allegation until people are found to be guilty. But what we do know is 2 of the people that were arrested at the time of Householder's arrest, that were his associates, have in fact pled guilty as part of the bribery and racketeering charges. We also know that Neil Clark ended his own life. So what is very, very clear is we deserve to actually be able to follow the money. And so what's really important in this whole saga is that dark money was used to influence public opinion. Dark money was used to get in Larry Householder's preferred candidates or his friends into office so that they could vote to pass House Bill 6. And we should be able to follow the money because no one should be able to buy public policy in this way. It's just wrong.
I was just going to say dark money was also used to foment really hate against Asians with those absolute terrible ads about somehow if you signed a petition that your information was going to go to China. And just really to straight up lie to people about petitions, which for us here at League and Common Cause, petitions, really collecting lots of petitions was how we were able to get the General Assembly to play ball with us and put reforms on the ballot for redistricting in 2015 for state maps and 2018 for congressional map making. So I just wanted to just jump in there because we need to talk some districts here because this is a big year. And I would like for you to tell folks how excited we are about this year and some of the things we're doing.
So I'm very excited, but I also wanted to highlight, do not forget that we need to shine a light on dark money. House Bill 6 has a hearing this week. It's on Thursday at 9 a.m. You can actually, this is Government Oversight Committee, and you can actually watch it online. So please tune in. Meanwhile, back at the ranch or testify. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, I am so excited. We're finally actually to the year where we're actually doing map making. For many of us, this has been a long slog. I'm guessing that there are folks on this call that first worked on redistricting reform in 1981. And then they worked on it in the late 90s when the League was collecting signatures. And then there were our legislative ballot, our legislative woes. And 2005 when, yes, we lost Reform Ohio now. Anyway, meanwhile, back at the ranch, we finally passed state legislative redistricting reform in 2015. In 2018, we passed congressional. And we're finally to 2021. So we could get fair maps next year, but it's going to take all of us. And we do know that the pandemic has made things more complicated, including the release of the decennial data that we need from the census for the map making. And so we need at this point to be really planning a sensible timeline, which includes lots of time for public deliberation, because we will be getting that information from the census about the time we really should have our state legislative districts already. And the first deadline for congressional. And so we need to, be having conversations about, hey, do we need to move the primary? How are we going to make sure there is good time for public input so that we don't have maps drawn behind closed doors and we can't let folks engage in shenanigans. We need to have a good, robust discussion because we only get fair maps when we're really pushing.
Right. So our theory of winning is that we've been working on this for a half a century, and it's been the people who have pushed for fair maps and those reforms to pass, and now it'll be the people that hold map makers accountable to the letter and spirit of the law. We have all these helpers. I'm hoping one of those helpers will put in the chat the letter we sent 1 week ago today to map makers about all the things we could start doing now. One thing I want to be really clear about is that bad data would make bad maps. And so the solution is not just to rush the census and giving us bad data. And not just that, like as we think about all the other formulas that are based on the census, right? From low-income school lunches to transportation planning and emergency response services and healthcare services and economic development. These things are based on the census. And we have, we count everyone once every 10 years. And so it's really important that we try our best to balance the need for accurate data coming out of a really hard pandemic year, with the need for making maps in a way that we can be ready for our 2022 primary. So the thing that I'll say, and so there you see the letter, we have many things going on right now. We have a speakers bureau with hundreds of volunteers who are ready to speak to your organization about what's going on. Remember, it was the speakers bureau that we started in 2015 that helped us get to the victories. 2012, after we lost at the ballot box, to get to our victory in 2015 and then again in 2018. So the Speakers Bureau is really designed to help demystify the process, help everyday Ohioans figure out the way that they want to participate. We have community mapping. We have hundreds of people actually trained to do community mapping. So, and they can do both of these by Zoom, the Speakers Bureau and the community mapping. So maybe you have a group, you have a school group, a church group, a neighborhood association. Have us come in, and tell us what you think your neighborhood is like. And we will have someone who's trained in the mapping software to highlight that. And we'll be collecting all of that data and sharing it with map makers when it comes the time. We have a transparency team. We have where we are trying to get just to find out all the things that are going on. We're preparing people for hearings. We did have a question about All in the Line, and All in the Line is a really great organization. They are, and one of the things about us is that we try to work with anyone in the space. So we have regular conversations with All in the Line, and we have regular conversations with Republican lawmakers or Secretary LaRose. And so we share information, we engage with All in the Line, but we are slightly separate campaigns because League is, and Common Cause and Fair Districts Ohio are the nonpartisan advocates. And part of our rule, especially at League, is that we have to be careful how closely we partner with organizations that may be that may get funding or things like that from political parties. And so we have serious rules about that, but we're glad that All in the Line is on the state and engaging lots of folks, and that there are so many individuals doing so. Hopefully that answers that question. So we work together when we can. We agree a lot. There might be some times that we don't, but we will continue those conversations with All in the Line, as well as Secretary LaRose and others. Catherine, do you have anything on that?
I don't think so. The one thing I was going to highlight when I went through the list of like, hey, we went through this and we went through that and we had this setback when it came to redistricting reform. I always wanted us to take a moment to realize that in 2005, we did not pass congressional redistricting reform. But what we did is we lost. But to make us lose, the state legislature actually came into session in August and quickly passed early vote. And the reason we have early vote is not, out of the goodness of their heart. It's because they thought, oh, this is the part of that Reform Ohio Now proposal that is the most popular. What we're going to do is we're going to take it away from this initiative to make sure it doesn't pass. And so anytime you go and you vote early, or you vote no fault absentee, just remember that sometimes you fail forward.
Yeah, that's a great point. Laura Moorman has a really great question. DeWine's initial response was that there's no urgency to get started now. Is that still his position? I think this is exactly the point, is we haven't had a public statement from the governor since we sent our letter. And of course, we are working to follow up with the governor in private meetings. But I think it's really important for folks to call the governor and ask that the redistricting commission get started on what it can. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that at all, Catherine. I think it goes back to Jen and Catherine. We can't just blink our eyes and make fair maps. So it kind of takes all of us. What's the role that the public can do on that?
So I keep thinking about the fact that there is that reaction, oh, we don't have census data. That means we can't really do anything. And why are you bothering me about this in April? Well, that all makes sense until you realize all the different steps that are necessary. And that, in 2020, at the very last minute, we moved to primary, and we don't want to go through that again. And so, encouraging them to get started with planning a sensible timeline which engages us, and hears, from different stakeholders, including election officials and people who will be on the ballot in that primary of 2022. I think this is really important. And so we all, as Ohio voters, have a vested interest in having a really good, solid plan. And it's important to just let folks know, touch base with your state reps, touch base with the governor.
And with and Connie Rubin mentions also, of course, the Secretary of State LaRose. And I did mention that we have a lot of dialogue with the Secretary LaRose, and I really appreciate that. We don't always agree, but we do have a lot of dialogue, and we are talking to Secretary LaRose about redistricting. Secretary LaRose, he won the election and wasn't even secretary yet when we first started talking about what we were going to do in 2021 about fair maps. So you're right, though. Pressure, call your lawmakers, call the redistricting commission members who are named, and ask them to get started now, and ask them for fair maps. I think it's absolutely important. Okay, we've gotten a couple questions about voter turnout, which I know is such an important issue to you and I both, and to all of our members. We've got 120 people on the call here. I know that probably all of them have registered a voter or shared, a voter guide link or done something, right? So what are some of the things we can do to increase voter turnout? And I know they're asking for one thing. And I think one thing to increase voter turnout is to have more competitive legislative elections personally. But let's talk about some of those other things we think we can do.
So when we think about voter turnout, the simplest reason that people do not show up is they're actually not registered. Okay, so making sure that we have robust voter registration programs, and we look at reforms that make sure that people are properly registered. And so this includes like making sure, automatic voter registration, same day election day voter registration is a reform that could make a tremendous difference in turnout. So we look at our neighbors, those folks from Michigan, their voter turnout went way up as a result of same day voter registration. So the other thing that I think is so essential when it comes to like voter engagement really has to do with highlighting that there are important elections, not just when the president is running. And so like when I think about the kinds of activities, for example, in Georgia that they did to get people ready, it wasn't just voter registration. It was like, well, okay, we're going to register you to vote. Here are some important issues. Here are the steps so that you know how you're going to cast a ballot. Are you committed to casting? So like we're learning from other states, and I think we really should do what we can so that we come up with a really robust program. And I'm thinking the League of Women Voters are the folks who are going to lead the way.
Absolutely. So a couple things real quick. First, there was a question about registering voters at vaccination sites. That is been there. We have asked about that, and they do not want that. They don't want to have more people gathering, more chaos, more confusion. So just keep that in mind, that that's not something that we are doing after looking into it. We are at our very end right now. I wanted to say a couple things. Julie Sutton just mentioned that she is sending postcards to the task force members as she listens. That's awesome. So again, if you go to our Fair Districts website, which one of our helpers will absolutely get that website up there, there's all kinds of ways that you can get involved, including asking for postcards that you can send out to map makers. In the meantime, I'm hoping that Catherine, you'll give us one last kind of word. It was upside down, which I actually really love, because sometimes I feel that way. Yep. So I do feel slightly upside down. One last word of encouragement for all of our lovers of democracy who've tuned in.
Well, I just think there's this wonderful power and promise of democracy. And together we can work on this and make it a reality so that all our voices are heard, and that our candidates then go off to represent us are actually coming from our communities. And I just wanted to thank everybody who's on this Zoom today. And thank you for including me. I really appreciate it.
Let's pull up these slides. And while that happens, I'm going to say that, Catherine, if there was ranked choice voting or any sort of voting, I would always vote for you because you are just, I feel blessed every day to get to work with you because your heart is big, your brain is big, and you just have so much know-how and integrity. So thank you for being such a dear friend to us. Let's go to the next slide. Here are some things that we have going on right now. For those who are super interested in fair districts, we've got a Speakers Bureau training and exploration of the Voting Rights Act and how that intersects with redistricting work, as well as several other events coming up. Let's go to the next slide. Just want to remind everyone that we do have a new program called Youth in Action, which is activism led for and by young leaders. Next slide. Please join. One of the things about becoming a league member, and we didn't talk a lot about it, is that we can, because of these reforms, take lawsuits against bad maps to the Ohio Supreme Court. But the way that we have standing is by having members who've been impacted. And so being a member, even if you don't have time to do a lot of other things, you can become a member and that helps us. Next slide. Also donating helps too. So this is our 100th anniversary. You can get your pin if you donate and become part of the Centennial Club. And I think that's it. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Michael Barron and Cynthia and the entire wonderful, absolutely incredible Ohio League and Common Cause team members. And we will all be checking in again soon. Thank you.